Okay, so in the last episode of From the Luthier's Workbench, which was episode 22, I started a two-part series on how I apply a wipe-on polyurethane finish. And what I talked about was sanding the wood and then applying a sanding sealer in preparation for applying the wipe-on poly. So what I'm going to do in this episode is I'm going to finish that prep and then show you how I apply the wipe-on poly. So let's get started. After applying the second coat of sanding sealer, I let the guitar sit for a couple of hours to make sure it was completely dry. It says on the can that you can start sanding it after an hour of dry time, but I let it go a little bit longer. Now, because sanding sealer is so thick and has to be applied with the brush, you can't spray it and you can't wipe it on. And because it dries so quickly, you're going to have a lot of brush marks and general sloppiness in the sanding sealer. However, because it's designed to be sanded, it's quite easy to get smooth again. So what I did was, after it was dry, is I went back in and level sanded the surface of the guitar with 220 grit sandpaper. I did find that sanding the flat surfaces takes a little bit more time than I was hoping, so I just switched over and used my 5-inch diameter 8-hole random orbital sander with 220 grit disc, and that allowed me to sand the top and the back in about 2 minutes. Went very, very quickly. The sanding sealer is supposed to sand, supposed to powder up and not gum up your sandpaper. However, I found it does gum it up, so you have to just be aware of that. And it's probably going to mean having to use one disc for the top and then a fresh disc for the back. And then for the edges, I just took a pink eraser, wrapped it up with some 220 grit, and sanded all the way around. And then once I was done, once I had it nice and smooth, I wiped it all down, and then I repeated the process entirely by hand with 400 grit. I didn't use the random orbital sander. I just wrapped up my pink eraser with some 400 grit and then sanded the whole surface down. After that was done, I took a clean cloth, dampened it with some denatured alcohol, and then wiped down the surface to remove any residue, sanding powder residue, so that won't interfere with applying the wipe-on poly. And that's where I'm at right now. I'm ready to start applying the wipe-on poly. And to do that, I'm going to be using, this is just white t-shirt material. I buy a bag of rags at the local hardware store, and I'll take this and cut it up into pieces so that I can get a bunch of them out of this. And the reason why I like to use t-shirt material instead of paper towels is that paper towels tend to leave a lot of little tiny wood fibers or pulp fibers in the surface of the finish. So to reduce that, I use a clean cloth because it doesn't leave as much lint. And then and that's why you want to make sure whatever you use has been washed and cleaned and dried and doesn't have a lot of lint on the surface of it. Now, if you do want to use paper towels, I can recommend Viva brand paper towels because those leave very few lint particles in the surface, and they actually work quite well for this. So let's get started. There are a couple of ways that you can apply wipe-on poly, and it really depends on the outcome that you're looking for. You can apply a thin coat, let it sit for a couple of minutes, usually 3 to 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes because it will start to tack up. Let it sit for 3 to 5 minutes, and then wipe off the excess. And as you're wiping it off, you're actually smoothing out a very thin coat and making the surface very smooth. This is great if you're looking for that natural hand rub oil look. If you want to build up a finish and then polish it to a high gloss shine, what you would do is then coat the whole guitar. And you want to make sure that when you coat it, you're not putting so much on that it could cause some runs or drips. You just want to get the surface completely covered with the wipe-on poly. And then you would let it dry for several hours and then apply a second coat. And then you would continue doing this. You don't necessarily have to sand between coats. I don't find that to be necessary. But you would continue doing that, building up, say, 5, 6, 7 coats. And then when you're done, you would go back and level sand, usually starting at around 400 grit, and then working your way up to, if you have a buffing machine, you would work up to say 800 grit, at which point you could buff it out to a high gloss shine. If you don't have a buffing machine, you would probably want to continue level sanding and polishing up to about 1500 to 2000 grit. You could go higher if you've got micro mesh. But then at that stage, you would polish it out. And if you've got a buffing machine, that certainly makes it a lot easier, and it goes much faster. But if you don't have a buffing machine and want that high gloss shine, after you finish level sanding it to 2000 grit or higher, you can use one of these electric sheet sanders. But instead of using a piece of sandpaper, you could use like a piece of denim or a piece of cloth, and then you can polish it out that way. And these are cool because what you can do is cut several pieces of denim, use one with rubbing compound, then attach another clean one, and then use that one with some polishing compound. And then after you're done, you would probably use a swirl remover applied by hand to finish it off. But I'm going for that natural kind of hand rubbed oil look, so I'll show you how I do that. I cut the application cloth down in size, so I've got a bunch of them cut to, it's roughly 6 by 6 inches. And what I'll do is I'll fold it up. And what I like to do is fold the seams into the center so that I don't have any edges exposed. And that way, the edges, that's where the lint comes from. So now I have a nice surface in which to dip into the poly and then apply it. The poly comes in two varieties. There's gloss and the satin. I prefer to use the gloss, and the reason is because I can really control the level of sheen. With the satin is formulated with matte agents or flattening agents that keep the shine down to give it that satin sheen. And the problem is if you decide you want a little bit more sheen, there isn't a whole lot you can do to improve it. With the gloss, I can have much greater control over the sheen. If I decide that I don't want it to be so glossy, I can, after polishing it out, I can sand the surface with a sanding pad, and I'll use, this is a Mirka Aberlon pad, and I'll usually start with 1000 grit and then work up to 4000 until I get the sheen I want. But I just have a lot more control over the level of sheen when I use the gloss, so that's what I'm going to use. When I apply this stuff, because I'm going to be wiping it on, letting it sit for a couple of minutes, and then wiping it off, I found it's best to work on one surface at a time. If you try to do the entire guitar at once, when you start to wipe it off, by the time you get to the last part of it, there's a chance that the poly will have tacked up enough to make it very difficult to wipe off. So I'm just going to do the top first. I'll apply it, wipe it off, then I'll do the sides, and then I'll do the back. And then once that's done, I'll let it dry for a couple of hours, and then I'll repeat the process a second, maybe a third time, depending on how it's looking. And then once it's done, that's when I can take it to the buffer. I'm just using, this is just a plastic container I picked up at the dollar store. And the wipe-on poly has a bit of an amber color, so you need to be aware of that if you're applying this over color. It will have an effect of kind of warming up any tint that you have on there. But for the hand-rubbed oil look, that should be just fine. So I'm just going to kind of soak some up onto the rag, and then I'm going to apply it over the surface. And the idea is to try to apply a consistent application. Now you'll see little air bubbles in the surface. Don't worry about that. They will level out into the finish. And then we just want to get a nice wet coat. Make sure all of it is covered. So this is how the surface looks after applying the wipe-on poly, and as I'm letting it sit and soak in a little bit. So you can see it's fairly wet, but it's relatively consistent. And once it has finished soaking in a couple of minutes. I'm going to wipe it off. Okay, so I applied a coat of the wipe-on poly, and I've let it sit for about 4 minutes. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start wiping off the excess. And hopefully this angle that I'm shooting at will show you what the surface looks like as I wipe it off, because that's kind of important. What the goal is we want it to sit for a few minutes to let it kind of soak into the wood and to kind of thicken up a tad before wiping it off. If you don't let it sit long enough, you'll end up wiping all of it off. And we don't want to do that. We want to leave a thin film of it over the surface. And of course, you don't want to mess around with it too much. Just a quick application, let it sit, and then wipe it off. Don't linger in any one area for too long, or it will start to tack up on you. When that happens, you start getting rag marks and all kinds of ugly issues. So that's really all it takes. And now I'm going to hang it up, let it dry, and then I'll come back and probably do a couple more coats. And usually, after 4 or 5 coats, it should be built up enough that I have a nice, consistent, smooth sheen across the surface. And that's really the goal, is to make it as consistent as possible. Okay, one other thing I should mention about wiping off the excess poly is that when you do it, you need to use a clean cloth. As the cloth becomes contaminated, you need to look for clean spots on the cloth. Otherwise, those contaminated spots will cause the rag to drag through the finish, and you'll end up with drag marks. So you want to keep looking for clean spots. Now, if you do make a mistake and end up with some drag marks, it's no big deal as long as you act quickly and just grab your application cloth, put a little bit of poly on it, and then wipe the area down, and that will reactivate it and dissolve your mistake. So then you can just wipe it away and you're good to go. So I've just got the guitar hanging from the ceiling after wiping off that first coat of poly, and I'll let it sit here for probably about an hour or so, and then I'll be ready to do the next coat. Well, this is how the surface of the guitar body looks after applying about 5 applications of the wipe-on polyurethane. As you can see, it's pretty smooth, and there are minimal rag marks in it. There are a few, but not too bad. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lightly sand the entire surface with I'll start with about 1,000 grit Mirka Abralon pad, and then I'll work my way to 2,000, then to 4,000, and at that point I'll take it over to the buffer and buff it out, and we'll see what kind of sheen that I'm able to get with this finish. As I'm sanding, I'm using a bright overhead light to kind of gauge the reflection, and that helps me to see any flaws that might be in the surface. I'm talking about things like little tiny spots of lint that may have deposited on the surface while the polyurethane was drying. And there may also be some slightly more obvious rag marks, and to take care of those, I'm going to step down in grit to 800 and just lightly sand those areas, and then go back and hit it with 1,000 grit to smooth it out and make it consistent with the rest of the surface. Well, I've finally reached the last step in this process. I'm going to polish out the surface of the wood with my buffing machine. I know that I had said earlier that I was going for a hand-rubbed oil finish look, and I'm still after that. What I'm looking for specifically is somewhere between a satin and semi-gloss sheen. I almost want the guitar body to look like the wood has been polished itself. And I'm not really interested in getting a high gloss mirror-like shine. If I was going to do that, I would build up many more coats. But you're probably wondering, why would I take it to the buffing machine if all I want is the satin to semi-gloss shine? Well, after applying and then wiping off the polyurethane, when you look closely at it, you can see, even though the surface appears very smooth, there are some very subtle rag marks still in the finish. Those are almost impossible to get rid of when you're applying and then wiping it off, but the buffing machine will melt those away. And then once I'm done, if I decide there's too much of a shine, I can knock that back with some Mirka Abralon 4000 grit sanding pads. So let's get started with the polishing. This is how the surface looks before buffing it, and hopefully the video will show that there are some very subtle streaks left by the rag when I applied the polyurethane. I'm going to start using this wheel, and I'm going to be using, it's a Brown Menzerna coarse polishing compound. And then this is how the surface looks after polishing it on the buffing machine. Okay, so this is how the guitar body turned out after polishing it on the buffing machine. And when you look at it at a low angle like this, you can see that there's quite a bit of reflection. But then once you tip it more straight on, you can see it's definitely more of a satin sheen. So I would call this something somewhere between satin and semi-gloss. And at this stage, the body is finished. As far as the neck was concerned, I did basically the same finish. I sanded the shaft of the neck with all the way to about 800 grit, and then I applied a single wipe-on coat of the polyurethane, let it soak in, and then wiped it off. I did not, however, put any poly on the fretboard. The fretboard I left naked. The only times I'll put a finish on a fretboard is if it's a maple fretboard, and then I use nitrocellulose to clear coat it. But for the back of it, after the polyurethane had soaked in, dried, or soaked in and been wiped off and dried, I went back and sanded the contour area with 800 grit paper, and then followed that with 1000, 2000, and 4000 grit Mirka Abralon. I also sanded the front and the back of the headstock, and then I polished those with the buffing machine so that it would match the body. The fretboard, like I said, was left naked. It was sanded to 4000 grit, and then the wood itself was polished on the buffing machine. So now I'm ready to install, level, dress, and polish the frets. And then I'll be ready to do the final assembly of this guitar. So that's really all it takes to do a simple wipe-on oil or wipe-on poly finish. I know it seems like a lot of steps, but really when you're doing it, it's not that bad. And from start to finish, I would say it takes about 2 days to do it. So you can't beat that. There's no long curing time necessary. It's pretty good to go after just a couple of days of work. So if you're looking for a quick finish that has a lot of flexibility, I highly recommend you take a look at the Minwax wipe-on polyurethane.